I want to welcome everybody to the HAI Weekly Research Seminar. It's a pleasure to be here, privileged to be here. My name is Jochen Kumm. I spent a decade or so running biomathematics for the Genome Technology Center, but now build medical AI applications pretty much across the world. And I have had the privilege of knowing and working with Krish for several years now, and I've learned a tremendous amount. But before we begin, for the Zoom audience, you can use Zoom chat to message the group, but please use Slido to ask questions. You can also use the upvote feature on Slido to help me prioritize questions during the question period. And we will have questions both from the live audience and from Slido during the question period. So again, I'm thrilled to introduce Krish. I think he's the associate professor at the Stanford Doerr School of Sustainability of Oceans and of Anthropology, and a senior fellow at the Woods Institute for the Environment. So he has done an amazing amount of work. I've been on the sidelines for much of it. Much of it I find mind-expanding and incredibly exciting in the sense that it provides a fantastic amount of data, and which is exceptional in its diversity and single-minded focus on understanding aspects of the past, using archaeology, ecology, oceanography, anthropology. And talking about the past, I'll skip over this. Using the past is surprisingly tricky. Past performance is not indicative of future results, is one opinion. And the other opinion might be that those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it. We know those quotes. They come from different environments. And Krish asked me to speak for 3 minutes about what I think about this. I would like to point out that the kind of data that he provides are incredibly valuable, and that he's building a body of data that could be used to drive forward several new applications or new styles of AI. And people at HAI are probably very well aware of the importance of curating and building data sets that can be used to drive AI development. So my main interest today is multimodal AI because I work in medicine. This is taken from a beautiful review article that shows the kind of thing that happens in medicine. You know this, when you go to the doctor, you don't just take one test and they go on. There's a conversation, etc. That's multimodal AI, many inputs, different types, and you somehow put them together. I want to contrast, and to a lesser extent, no pun intended, there's tiny AI, which is I view, in my personal opinion, as an engineering advance that's incredibly important. And mostly my world looks at these applications in genetic evolution, markets, agriculture, diagnostics, psychiatry. The only thing to say here is that they share one thing, they share two things. They are complicated with many players interacting in unpredictable ways. And secondly, that when you look at the money using a McKinsey report, not much money comparatively has flowed into these areas. That's an opportunity. And then you all know this. We live in a world today where it's more input, more layers, more parameters, and that has some problems. It takes more time, takes massive amounts of energy, there's perhaps unlimited bias, and fewer contenders in the space. And I think what it is, it's got this sort of linear approach. You go from left to right. You have input, you produce a single output. Now, I'm not going to get into this. Multimodal is different in that sense that you saw that in the previous pictures. You have many inputs, you combine them together, you allow for interactions. Learning is not only about optimizing one flow, but optimizing the system understanding. And that's for the audience to discuss. Of course, there's a fair amount of work to be done here, but recent publications and advances show us that we have a really high chance of success of doing something here that will add to the body of knowledge. Data sets and questions drive this process. And that's what the center point of today. The other thing that I think is really important for today and for this audience is that the dialogue, communication between the builders, the AI builders, and the users, anthropologists, oceanographers, etc., is key. I speak in part because that's been key in my world, which is medical applications. And I believe that we're in an exciting moment that we can discuss maybe later, that no-code or low-code AI is not the perfect solution, but it opens up the door for communication between people, such as Krish and myself, and many others. And so I see this also as an opportunity to create a venue for people who would not normally participate in AI to actually participate. And in my opinion, just like I have learned more from Krish than he could possibly learn from me, I think people who are going to use no-code AI, try things, are going to teach the AI community more than we can teach them. And but again, I have only admiration for Krish, and my good friend, and the work he's doing, and the immense energy and effort he's put into it.
Thank you very much, Jochen. That's so kind of you. A very over-generous introduction. And that's maybe the last time you're going to hear anything about AI, because I'm an archaeologist. The reason he's learned more from me is because what he's doing is infinitely more complicated for my little brain to understand. So we were trying to make sure that we present something that shows the extent to which AI can be useful for the types of projects that maybe, I'll just mention this because I have recently become a member of the New School of Sustainability, the types of things that, for example, the Stanford Doer School focus on sustainability, the kind of applications that perhaps AI can be integrated into in ways that may not seem immediately relevant to the data science community from the outset. It really was a case of meeting Jochen in a very serendipitous meeting for the Center for African Studies, that we started the dialogue and explaining the types of projects that we were doing on our end and how AI could be useful for interpolation and understanding our data sets. There was a moment when the work that we were doing was really trying to be predictive, and I think we sort of see that as something for the future. But I thank you, Jochen, for that wonderful introduction. Thank you, Vanessa, and the events team, and Lane. I can't remember the other names. I was trying to remember 4 names. It's a bit difficult for me. I'm so sorry. Just a little bit about myself. My background is in biology, health, and ecology for sustainable development. So I don't have a typical background for an archaeologist. But ultimately, using that background, it gave me the opportunity to sort of build bridges between disciplines like archaeology and history, which are working with longitudinal data sets, and with disciplines like medicine, climate, and of course, data sciences. One of the things that was really a trigger for this project, and I'll sort of, throughout the talk, I'll introduce the test case. I think I was talking to Madeleine earlier about the types of talks and presentations that you may have seen. I really want to walk through locations and data sets and field work with you, because I think that's something that this is where some of the bridging needs to be made. The kinds of things that we do in the field should not be outside of the realms of what you do, because I've seen the ways that our collaboration with Jochen and so on, how useful that has been. Actually having Jochen come out to the field sites with me in Mauritius, which I'll talk to you about, was really instrumental in sort of deciding how to integrate some of these data sets. I'm sort of prefacing this because what I'm going to show you is the project as a whole. And we're working very much to integrate all of the data sets that I'll talk to you about. I want to give you the overview in its entirety, and then parcel out the elements that are, at the moment, we're having a little bit of success with the AI side of things, and with modeling and so on. So I'll just kind of slip through a few different models, talk you through the location, talk you through the malaria project itself, and then where we're going with that. And we focused on malaria for one particular reason. It's got a massive time depth. And I'm sure I can't stand in front of two places, but if I was to ask you how old malaria is, don't look, you might say to me 100,000 years. It's actually 30 million years old. The first evidence for malaria, Dominicus, is from a mosquito trapped in a piece of amber. So that time depth is massive. That's not the time depth that we're working with. I don't think those types of scales are actually quite relevant to human society, but the last 300 years are really relevant to human society. And that's a period that we're focused on, 300 to 500 years. When you consider that time depth, 30 million years, it's easy for me to say to you that malaria has affected our genomes, it's affected the way we build structures, even if today that's kind of separated somewhat. It's affected where we live. It's affected wars. It's apparently been responsible for the decline of the Roman Empire. So there's really major markers. Huge demographic flux has taken place because of malaria. And some estimations suggest that malaria has accounted for up to 50% of the deaths that have occurred on Earth in humanity as a whole. I think that's an overestimation. I think there's much contradiction to that. But those euphemisms give us an indication of the power of malaria in the past. And if I was showing you a malaria map even 100 years ago, it would be endemic everywhere in the world other than Mongolia. And it's simply because we don't have the population density for the disease to be transmitted at an epidemic scale. I also don't need to make the case that studying disease over time is important, because we have a few case studies right in front of us of what a few months ago would have been mandatory. We've all experienced the pandemic. We've all experienced the social disruption that causes. And it's that relationship between disease and society that I want to focus on today. I want to show you how AI is helping us to understand that specifically. I'm going to focus on a set of one small island, barely registers on this big map. And this big map is really showing how much disease has moved across time, over time, and across space. This is not our own work. I want to be clear about that, but it really gives you an impression of the way that disease has really shaped society and had an impact in myriad ways. I really want to emphasize that Mauritius is one of those is a place where we have no indigenous population. It was a genuine, pristine ecosystem when humans first inhabited the island. So it's an ideal test case, and I'll try to make that during the presentation. And what we're doing now at the moment is to understand in a robust way the relationships between disease and society in this test case, but also hopefully in the future develop predictive models based on the data sets that we have. I don't think I need to make the case, but I will. We really set our sights on the most debilitating and oldest disease that humanity has faced because of this impact. And maybe even 5 years ago, I would have had 1 million annual deaths up there. It's relatively, we might think that's a downward trend. 2016, 17, there was social disruption, ecological disruption in places like Yemen, parts of South America, and we saw a 5 million increase rate. 5 million individuals more caught malaria than the year before. So it's a condition that's constantly in flux. And with that kind of antiquity, it really is something that we need to study from the perspective of a longitudinal basis, and particularly when we consider the massive levels of ecological and demographic change. In particular, I mean, Jochen pointed out to me earlier when we were putting the presentation together, this is a really good example of how the drastic landscape changes that we see today and the scale of landscape changes. What I want to do, though, is I'm showing you the ecology behind this, but I want to emphasize that the social sciences, basically, unlike the clinical sciences, for example, have really shown us that disease is much more complex than the direct impacts on the body. So that's what we're trying to look at, is the much broader social and environmental context, how malaria interacts in a particular environment and what the human actions do, such as deforestation, monocrop agriculture, dam building, for example, and of course, expanding urbanization. All of those things are having a huge impact on disease. modern studies, they tend to focus, this is a generalization, so please nobody throw stones at me, but they tend to focus on single parameters because we study, for example, temperature over time depths of about 5 to 10, 20 years. And we actually believe that's insufficient to understand the disease. It might give us a snapshot, but it's not really a clear understanding. So we broaden the temporal and spatial context. We look at land use, mobility, policy, and transmission. We've got evidence on all of these factors over the last few hundred years. And basically, the key point is to assess the interrelationships between climate and culture. And in some cases, this relationship mitigates the epidemic, and in some cases, it exacerbates the epidemic. And we want to better understand that. That's all I want to say in terms of background to malaria and the background to the project. I will move on to the case study. This is only slightly gratuitous, this picture, only slightly, because this is actually one of our test sites is from here, this region. This is called Le Brabant. It's on the southern tip of Mauritius, the country that the island that we're focusing on. Mauritius, as I mentioned, you had no indigenous population. It witnessed incipient emergence, epidemic proportions, and elimination of malaria. It's one of only 2 places in Africa that has eliminated malaria entirely. And the reason the lack of an indigenous population is important is that we know there were no human strains of malaria prior to, I won't go into the history, but prior to 1568 when the island is first colonized by the Dutch. I'll just spend a few quick slides, but I do want to mention this is a site of immense importance. It's a World Heritage Site because it commemorates resistance to slavery. And so colonialism is going to be a theme I'm going to run through the presentation. As mentioned, there's no indigenous population. So all the changes that we see are consequential to human activity. And this is really an island colonized under colonialism. The very first colonization begins the process of forest decimation. So the ecological change happens right away with hardwood exploitation, teak and ebony and so on. We have an introduction of enslaved people right away. During the period, the French period, which is from 1710, there's the introduction of sugar on a relatively large scale, but not to the scales that we see subsequently under the British. What happens under the French is also the introduction of large mammals. And we might think of things like pigs and cats damaging ecosystems, but herbivores, ungulates, cattle, basically, do a large amount of damage, not just because of their presence, but also because they open up pathways into forests that allow other animals to also destroy habitats. What's important for our purposes is that cattle introduce nitrogen into the environment. And I just want you to keep that point in mind. I'll come back to that in a second. With the British, so we have a very large population of enslaved people during the French period. The British take over the island in 1810, which a date might be reasonably familiar to you. 1807 is when the trade in slavery is abolished. So Britain has to find a way to have a labor force on this island. Around this point, basically Britain turns to India, and we go from about 90,000 people of predominantly African descent to 450,000 people predominantly of South Asian descent. So the context of the colonial context is not what I want to emphasize here. It's that context of demographic flux. And the movement of populations is really impactful within a disease context. So sort of just keep that in mind. At the same time, maybe 2 or 3 decades afterwards, an island that is 1,840 kilometers squared is effectively producing 7 to 10% of the world's sugar. That's a almost complete transformation of the island's ecology at the same time that we're seeing this massive transformation in population as well. And perhaps unsurprisingly, there's massive ecological impacts too. The general habitat loss and reduction goes from about 98% forest, actually accurate figures are 95.6, to 2% forest in the present day. And that transformation is an overturn from forest to sugar crop. So again, the monocrop agriculture that I was describing earlier to you. Perhaps most famous casualty is the dodo. Mauritius is the island where the dodo was exterminated, and it's the first species to go extinct as a consequence of modern colonialism. But we also, the Mauritian kestrel at the top was the one-time rarest bird in the world, pink pigeon as well, and the only endemic mammals were bats. And of 3 species, 2 are on the brink of extinction, 1 has already gone. But it just tells you something about when you change the landscape to that extent, you have huge biodiversity loss. There's also data behind all of this, and that's what I want to sort of emphasize. We've done some work on the demography. So we've done a lot of work on the ecology, which I'll talk to you about in a second. But we've done a lot of work on the demography. You can imagine that with this no indigenous population, massive transformation, 3 waves of colonial hegemony, and a lot of ethnic groups coming together, Mauritius has a really uniquely diverse population. Some work, and we've got 2 new studies on the modern DNA coming out now. And if you compare Mauritius to Comores and La Réunion, for example, it sits much more evenly between South Asian, African, and European populations. And we have an Austronesian signal coming to the island from Madagascar as well. So the things that I just want to emphasize there, all of that is to say, massive, rapid and very drastic ecological and demographic factors, transformations. And those factors we know have a really important and major impact on disease. And perhaps unsurprisingly, and I just move now to the main focus, that's all background for Mauritius, I'll move to the main case study of malaria itself. No surprise that this had a huge impact on the island itself. Given those ecological and demographic contexts, Mauritius basically, it becomes infamous for its relationship with vector-borne diseases. In fact, when Roland Ross, a famous malariologist, when he discovers the pathway for malaria transmission, he discovers that while he's a medical officer in India, the first thing he does is he comes to Mauritius to undertake a study there, proposes all of these measures to reduce and eliminate malaria. Because Mauritius was such a kind of hotbed for these epidemics, malaria is the reason we have the data sets we have. Bad air, malaria. In 1867, we reach a stage after a series of epidemics, we reach a stage of possibly one of the largest epidemics. At that time, 10% of the population is eradicated from malaria. And that has, that's massive impact on the colonial enterprise, but a huge impact on the local population too. And it stimulates a number of things. For example, immigration is stopped to the island, investments are made in quarantine infrastructure, which I won't go into. But perhaps the main and most clearly overt impact is the establishment of the Bois Marchand Cemetery, because the small cemeteries of the island simply couldn't deal with that number of deaths. So this cemetery was the 3rd biggest cemetery in the world when it was inscribed, the largest in the Indian Ocean. There's 400 acres. And it's actually, you can see it's a still functioning contemporary cemetery. You can see the way that the arrangement really followed a much more organized system. And usually I use an image of how people were being buried in Brazil during the pandemic. And it literally is, you're kind of mimicking the same type of thing. So 200 something odd years on. This cemetery, I didn't emphasize malaria, but bad air was a concept, okay? Miasma theory, we pass on diseases through bad air. That moved on around this period, a little bit later than this actually, to germ theory, where we understand germs are the method of transmission. But during this time, miasma was the pervading idea. And so we actually, by virtue of this immense serendipity, we have an entire portion of this cemetery from 1867 that was never opened because people thought they would redistribute the disease. And that is one of the quirks of archaeology, where you can find something that remains untouched for 100 and something odd years. And we had an opportunity to excavate this actual cemetery tied specifically to the biggest epidemic of malaria in the region. So that's a huge boon for us. And that effectively, since 2011, was the catalyst for this project. It gave us an opportunity. We know we're working on a case that's really important for malaria. We've got a huge amount of data set from this site. And I'll run through some of that. For example, we have over 100 burial archives dating back to the mid-19th century. And in fact, this archive that I'm showing you here is from 1868, so 1 year after this main epidemic and the establishment of the cemetery. We've got all sorts of information, name, the origin of the individual. So I just skip back to that slide here. We effectively can overlay a person's record from where they were emigrating from, be it in India, for example. We also have individuals coming from Jamaica, from Ireland, etc., with the individual's grave number. And actually then we have their whole information, their life biography from osteological analysis. Okay, and just step back from that 1 second. We also happen to have a map of this cemetery from that period as well. So we know spatially as well where people were located. This is the portion of the cemetery that was never opened. We can associate it with the period of indenture, i.e., right during that period of the epidemic, because indentured laborers tended to be categorized as Hindu, and it's a bit faint, but in general at that time, so in the burial records, they record fever as malaria deaths, and here they've written plague on this historic map, which again was another kind of catch-all term for diseases that presented with anemic conditions, malaria. We've got a huge sample of human remains that we can, we've of course permissions to excavate, provide us with information on diet, provide us with information about the working conditions. That's very important. I'll explain why in a second. But also a huge repository of genomic evidence. So we look at both the genetic evidence for demography, so where are people moving from, but also pathogens. So we work with the geogenetics lab in Copenhagen and look at the entire sweep of pathogens that are possible to recover genetically from contexts like this. We also, you'll just be able to see it, but we're looking at things like dental calculus. So it's a plaque, basically, when it hardens. And it's a very good indicator for microbiome of the mouth. And again, gives us another genetic signature that we can pull off other types of information. And we're looking at some of these residues here. We believe that those are proteins that have concreted during the process of decay of the coffins themselves. We may not be able to find Plasmodium falciparum DNA, but we may be able to find the expression of the DNA in the proteins that we can recover from here. So there's a broad sweep of evidence that's coming through, and the genomic evidence is particularly key for us. Something that's much more innovative, certainly for archaeology, historical archaeology, is to use climate proxy evidence. So we've done a survey of Porites corals, which capture really precisely climatic conditions over a period of 200 to 300 years, depending on their size. We've identified the corals that we want to drill. Permitting is in place for that now. We've already got some of these drilled already. And this is effectively, the best analogy I can say is that this is like a tree ring. Each one of these bands is a semi-annual growth ring. And within these bands, I ask you to remember cattle, we've got very good signatures of nitrogen runoff, for example. So it gives us a very clear indication of the changes in agriculture over time. We have sea surface temperature, which we have our own instruments in the water now recording temperature. We can align that with air temperature so that we know fluctuations in temperature over time as well. But these are really unique ways of gathering the broadest sweep of ecological, demographic, but if you can imagine from the archives I've shown you, we've got excellent evidence of political decision-making, how many people are moving to the island, this wonderful suite of data sets from many, many different fields. And I'm not presenting everything to you now, but that data assembly is itself really important. So for example, our instrumental records on temperature, huge archival records. Mauritius has over 2 million archives in the National Archives in Mauritius itself, and then others in Kew, in other parts of the world as well. So there's a data mining process taking place now. We basically can produce an assemblage of data that gathers historical evidence from climate proxies, and information from the human remains themselves, and really helps us to build an important data assembly that allows us to address some of the key questions. I really want to emphasize that data assembly itself, how beneficial it is to have those data sets being brought together. As you can imagine, the data sets are rich, they're very large. I haven't given you all of the sites that we're working on, but we probably have access to about 2,500 skeletons in this project overall, which, if you imagine each data point for DNA, et cetera, it does become a usable and robust data set. We've got human, parasite, and vector DNA. So from some of these cores that we're taking from the terrestrial context, we anticipate recovering the egg casings on the mosquitoes themselves, and we look at their DNA. So we really understand which vector was present at that time. And these archival records, they're all accurate to the monthly scale. And why that's important, accuracy to the monthly scale, we can basically look at agricultural flux through coral, we can look at instrumental records, and the archival records themselves are all accurate to a monthly scale. So it's the first time that we can actually correlate things like mortality profiles with ecological conditions. That's never been done. We can't do that today. There's too much flux in the ecology. By the time we're sort of matching mortality profiles to ecological change, we've missed the moment. We can do this historically using these types of data sets. And that's a really powerful thing to be able to do. We anticipate recovering the mosquito egg casings themselves. And again, the first time being able to align the DNA of the mosquito, of the vector, with the climatic conditions from a core, for example, we finally start to see how the mosquito's genome is changing as a function of ecological change as well. That's, again, something that is virtually impossible to do in the modern day because we need the longitudinal context to be able to do that. But perhaps the thing that is most useful in terms of this audience is the way that AI is allowing us to bring these disparate data sets together. And as just to be completely transparent and fair, we're not bringing all of this in yet. We're building the models now to be able to bring more and more of these data sets together. But just one example of where we've got to, it's actually a VPUE funded project, working with one of Jochen's working very closely. Our team is working very closely with a high school intern called Satvik, who's done some brilliant work. We've had a group of students here at Stanford digitize those burial archives. My colleague there has been the one directing that project. I have a couple of colleagues here who have helped with this project. There's many, many colleagues. From those transcribed records, our good friend and colleague Satvik ran an algorithm and basically pulled out something that was immediately sort of a challenge for us to understand. From those archives, if you are somebody who is an indentured laborer, if you go to hospital, what would you anticipate? You go to hospital with malaria, what would you anticipate happens? You might say to me, well, you recover, you get medical care, and you become better. It's the exact opposite. You're far more likely to die during that period if you go to hospital than if you stay at home. I happened to be writing a paper on global health and colonialism at that time. And I was doing a little bit of research myself. He sends me these results, and I can't explain them. It doesn't make any sense. People go to hospital to recover, not to die. When you start looking at the history, you find a reason. And actually, indentured laborers replaced enslaved people, but they had a wage. So they're doing much the same work, but they had a wage. They had to buy their own food. And they were in a system of basically debt labor. If you took a day off, you adopt a day's pay. You had to make that day up. The more days you lose, the more in debt you become. Indentured laborers did not go to hospital unless they were absolutely at death's door effectively. they would present in the hospital very undernourished, probably with more than 1 or 2 bouts of malaria already. They may have even traveled from India with malaria as well. You know of cases that happen. There's also a scientific basis to this that reinforces the historical context. Malaria tends to go, there's a small piece of research, I'm following up on it now, but it tends to go almost into a state of dormancy because your body is so malnourished, you're not doing a good job of moving blood around your body. The moment you have nutrition, it flares back up again. So you imagine a laborer is already under a heavy burden of malaria. They go to hospital, they receive food, the malaria flares up. We have a scientific and a historical explanation. The social and the scientific explanations come together really well around a point that we would never have understood otherwise. And I'm not saying this because of the audience. I've said this in other places. Without the AI to pull out that information in one relatively small case, so the potential for what we could do when we bring in more data is massive. But we would never have seen that looking at historical archives or even doing statistical analysis. These were entirely counterintuitive results. So we're putting this into publication today. Now, just read the book today. So I just want to, I hope that gives you a sense of the power of this, this data science toolkit for an archaeologist, for people working on longitudinal data sets. And that's where I'll leave the talk and just sort of tell you where we're going with some of this. Of course, we're very lucky to have, this is Satvik there, Jochen, our AI duo and team. We're working with a number of colleagues here at Stanford that have helped us to sort of conceptualize the project, from colleagues in medicine and so on. And Michelle Barry has been a huge supporter. We were funded by the Center for Innovation in Global Health. And there's many colleagues internationally that we're working with. But I have to say, this is a sort of slide of colleagues who are giving various expertise, but we work with a huge team of people locally. And there's a team of historians, archaeologists, et cetera, behind the project too. And I'm sorry that I'm not showing you all of those folks now. We work with a number of institutions internationally as well. We've got partners in a number of places. You can imagine this project is huge. We really need that kind of support and expertise beyond what Stanford is providing, although that's the basis here. And we've had very good support locally. I have to say VPUE have been brilliant in making. The reason I mentioned the VPUE project is that this is already something that attracts students' attention. We've oversubscribed twice over this year, scrambling to try to find pots of money to keep more of the students involved, because it's something that is appealing. You're sort of using AI in a way that really has an impact on society, an impact on understanding society. And we've got a few large grants. One with the ERC now, we've actually made it to the second stage. It's a 10 million euro grant. We won't get funded, but we'll keep our fingers crossed and we'll keep plugging away at that. We've also been in touch with Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation. I spoke to Steve Kearns a number of years ago before we'd really moved into this kind of format, because we want this ultimately to move into policy. We want these data sets to be applicable. If I can figure out the constellation of factors that influenced that epidemic in 1867, I can then use the AI to predict back. I would expect another epidemic here in 1830 and another epidemic here. And that's a really powerful way to say, when we predict in the future, we can be accurate about what's likely to happen with climatic, demographic, and other conditions that at the moment we're not really paying attention to. I also spoke to Stephen Hoffman at Fanaria. I mentioned to you being able to align the genome of the mosquito and the parasite with ecological change would actually be a really powerful way to support vaccine development. And we're moving towards good vaccines now, but it's still more information is applicable in this context. And Mauritius has been a good test bed for us to start this project. It's been a proving ground, and I hope I've shown you we've had some results already. I'm not talking to you at all about the kind of archaeological, historical, and other results that we've had. We just focus on the AI part of it. But we've kind of got comparative case studies in the southern and northern hemisphere with Italy, Venice, another really important case study. And I wanted to mention, I mentioned to you maps earlier. We've got brilliant historical maps of malaria itself, so we can look at transmission spatially as well. We're developing new projects in the Balkans and in Zimbabwe, where malaria is actually still epidemic here. So that's the idea, is that we scale from a brilliant, perfect test case to one where it's actually applicable in the modern world. I want you to take the concept that I'm describing, this approach, how we use longitudinal data sets, how we interpolate between many lines of evidence, and use your wonderful toolkit to help us do that. And we're also looking at the relationships between pastoralism, people, and policy. And this is work in Kenya. We've had some good results from that case study too. Partly looking at Rift Valley fever, but also looking at the kind of food security context there as well. How colonialism left legacies on human and environmental interactions, and how that can still cause harm today. What can we do to kind of disentangle some of those relationships? We've got a fairly large project in Mauritius as well, but also expanding into Madagascar, looking at fisheries and aquaculture, and how these relationships can be, how we can build better resilience in those cases, those locations. Again, using this kind of approach which says longitudinal data sets really have importance. I just want to leave you with sort of the broader impacts. Of course, it's very easy to apply this type of work to other vector-borne diseases, of course, to other human environmental interactions, in particular at this time when we're talking about sustainability. Just think about the climatic context, the kind of climatic data sets aligned with human actions. That's really what we want to understand. No amount of data explains human behavior, and that's really what we want to be able to do. But ultimately, the message I'd like us to sort of take home is the capacity to operationalize the past. And that's really what I sort of just used this slide. We effectively risk failure if we don't recognize that data detached, disentangled from human behavior, it invariably leads us to solutions that are not aligned with society's needs. And it sort of looks like we meet at some point in the future, but that's just an illusion. Okay? So AI is really offering us a powerful way to do that thing that this project really wants to emphasize, to operationalize the past, to bring the past not just as an anecdote, not as interpretation, not as something that remains back there, but use all of that wonderful data to help us contextualize and understand the context today. Thank you. Hand back over to you, Jochen.
All right. So I have a bunch of interesting questions here, but they are centered around some details. And so if you would permit me, I will ask one quick question. Every time we speak, I'm impressed with how much more data you're bringing in, how many more people you're working with. Do you have a process for what matters? No. What data are you looking for? And who do you work with? Or is it, how do you put it together?
Yeah. And
create a whole?
I understand. Yeah, thank you. The first one is really easy to answer. It seems that we should have it. If I can have a deep amount of data or large amount of data with good time depth. So we've looked at so many ecological parameters so archaeology is the best sort of multidisciplinary discipline. We pick all of these methods that help us. We sort of learn them a little bit. We bring in those experts if we need them, but ultimately we apply them, because if we want to understand human society today, we'd look at everything. If we want to understand human society in the past, we look at as much as possible. So I do my very best not to exclude data sets if I can possibly avoid that. What's more challenging is some of those data sets are really hard to gather. It's very difficult to get coral cores. One of the places that we want, of course, the place where we found the nicest coral is in MPA, a marine protected area. And it's, very difficult to get permits to do anything in an MPA, and rightly so. So that's the challenge. It's more to do with what's available to us and how much does it cost to extract that evidence. We do a lot of remote sensing work, which I haven't shown you. We use a lot of drone imagery, et cetera, et cetera. So the idea is just to keep adding those data sets that can give us an insight into something that we really couldn't find purely from the historical records themselves. The answer to the second question is, I think it's always best to work with people that you like.
And maybe you work best with the people you like.
People you like, yeah.
Any questions from the room? I'll come.
Thank you very much. This presentation was fascinating. The project is amazing.
Thank you.
But as a social scientist, I'm kind of wondering how you're building in cultural context to all the different cases that you're isolating, right?
Yeah.
Like Italy is very different, I'm imagining, than a colonial project. So, how are you building that into this broader, big data set, which is awesome. So thank you.
No, it's excellent. Thank you. And I'm glad there was no social scientists in the room. The challenge is, as you say, is we take it sort of from one level in some ways, and this is not a get out of jail quick card, but archaeology looks at those data sets almost within a temporal context. So we have very much better evidence actually on the ecological context from places like Venice. Much more work has been done in Europe than in Africa. So we can sort of align those. We align them along the temporal context. How I am trying to deal with, the team is trying to deal with the cultural side, is the huge amount of historical archival records that we have. It's a proxy, it's not ideal. What we do then is to use the material culture as the path, the route to tackling some of the cultural context as well. The Doge used to put a baby in front of his window to attract mosquitoes to the child, to the infant, rather than coming in. So there's all of these little cultural anecdotes. There's a moment at which that's anecdotal, and there's a moment at which some of that data can actually be pulled in, and some of the kind of political decision-making. The way I use the political decision-making, sorry, I'm just taking a step away from your cultural question. There's a lot of evidence of the amount of money spent on these interventions. And I remember speaking to Mark Gardner, who was the former director of the Population Health Studies Center, and he said, you've got a project that can actually tell us how much it will cost, at least as an estimate, to deal with the pandemic, how much it cost back then and how much it would cost. I know socioeconomic things are separate in that context, but it's a way of having an insight where we can bring some parity. It's more to sort of explain, how did it work in the southern hemisphere? How did it work in the northern? And I'm not trying to make them relative at the moment, if that makes sense. Does that answer the question? Thank you very much. I'm sorry, I'm not feeding on questions.
Yeah.
It wasn't me, somebody else.
Krish, I'm in charge. No, I do want to give voice to. Oh, sorry. No, we promise people from the outside world to get a chance. And there's a theme that's getting upvoted, which is people are very impressed with the concept operationalizing the past. At least 3 people here who've asked the same question, Shesh, Neil, and another person. How do you avoid bias? When do you know you can actually use the data without misrepresenting the past rather than operationalizing it? Yeah. And then there's a question about how to do this with multimodal, which we can or cannot address.
Okay, so I have a very, very naive understanding of AI. I'll make that point perfectly clear to you. I'm not the specialist. But what we tried to do was to make sure that we were in dialogue with all the specialists. That was the reason that I showed you all the experts that we have, because there's some things that don't make sense for the historian. We had quite a long discussion about this. How can we make that those things on culture, for example? How can we actually integrate that? What's the way that we can make those go from discussions about people's lives to a 0 and a 1, for example? I'm just using a very, but it's really challenging. But we understood that kind of initial adage of poor data in, poor results out, we could try to overcome that by making sure we were in dialogue with the climate scientists who were saying, yeah, that data set does align with this, it does make sense. I think that the challenge of bias is one of the big challenges that we're going to face. I try to look at this from the perspective of saying which data sets reveal precisely what was changing. Sea surface temperature is something I can talk about in an absolute term. At the moment, that's what we're working on. But the results that came out from Satvik's work, were entirely unanticipated. We were looking for different things. So again, it's one of those cases where I wouldn't have expected, I wouldn't have been able to sort of think, let's direct the research to address that question. And maybe that's the beauty of the AI toolkits. It can help us find things that we're not thinking about ourselves. So it's the balance point of the bias.
I agree with
that question.
No, I agree with that. And I think the beauty of AI is that a quantitative, algorithmic, structured approach gives us the opportunity to ask, do we have to believe this?
Yeah.
Right? When Sadwick first came to you,
yes.
you might have been very skeptical.
Yeah.
But and I think the community of AI has made massive progress in building in the kind of checks and sanity checks we should use. But I feel terrible about interrupting you earlier. So back.
Yeah. Thank you. Sorry, I missed part of your presentation, but it's really great. I used to live in Atlanta, and we worked a lot with CDC.
Okay.
Of course, like they're like treasure trove of data, which is remarkable, and that's nothing to do with documented, because they track real-time data, which is movement of people.
Yep.
So, which is a really big part, because majority of these diseases are human carriers.
That's the point. Exactly.
Because humans carry, it doesn't matter where it originated, has less relevance. That's why, like, going from an epidemic to a pandemic can be very fast.
Yeah.
Right? So given the global movement, how do you even think future archaeology? Because archaeology in the past is great, it's very static, but now it's all real time and it's changing really fast, even if you do longitudinally. So I'd be really curious on like how you're envisioning that in terms of like sources of data that you want to bring to the model and then also look at it. The second part is a model question, which is really around how are you even thinking about unknown variables and modeling for it, or having a flexibility or room in your model for an unknown variable. The unknown variable could be synthetic biology way of how we are actually creating mosquitoes to actually go kill other mosquitoes to deal with the malaria problem altogether.
Yep.
So synbio is playing a huge role both in the climate environment but also in diseases. So like how do you account for that in an archaeological context?
Perfect. So for me, initially this project was really trying to be predictive. And the idea was, it was all forward facing. As a team, we were going to figure out how to make this predictive. And we've got all of these parameters that describe ecological change over time and demographic flux and the other things that we might not have thought about. And it was just going to give us a prediction. And after working on that, in that direction for some time, I realized it was so much more complex than that. And in fact, maybe what I realized that was missing was the approach, and that the approach works very well for archaeohistoric data sets. And I have a discipline that's fairly broad, and social sciences in general, we are looking to understand those human relationships with things like epidemic disease and how they. And your point is really well made. There was this is one of my other colleagues' work who sort of looks at. It took a year to go to Australia in 1771, and 150 years later, you could do it in a month. So that's really a key part of our work as well, because at the beginning of colonization of Mauritius, it took a certain amount of time to get there. By the time we're talking about the period of indenture, people are moving in a matter of weeks, and they're still carriers of the disease. So that's a small component of that past work. What we've done recently is not exactly a pivot, but sort of to come back to the core of the work, to focus it very much on the archaeological questions and the archaeology, because there's still a huge amount of knowledge to be understood. I want to say something to you that's maybe not relevant. I didn't really mention it in the talk, but there's a huge science of colonialism that we've decided isn't really what we're going to study very much on. We're looking at historians look at colonialism. There is so much evidence. A quick tangent. We're all really aware of DEI now and what the legacies of colonialism do to personal relationships and how we need to increase diversity. Think about that in an environmental context. Think of how many landscapes have changed because of what happened during colonialism. And we're not really focusing on these last 300 years of ecological change. But that's the idea, is to sort of use these tools to better understand, better interrogate why we have social and environmental injustice today. That's kind of a component of it. But when I move towards your direction and try to address your question, it's really a challenge. The way that we've done it is to say we go from a coral core with 200 years of data up to 1830. And then we try to, let's say a little bit later than that, we've got some instruments in the ground that are in the water, actually, recording temperature now, so we can start to calibrate and we fix the relationship between where the coral finishes and what we have today. And we use, for example, satellite data that's very accurate for the last part, but that's temperature. And my whole premise has been we need to look at much broader data sets. So we're having to find ways to connect, kind of piece together the period that we know have very good evidence on, to the more recent period, which has been much more disrupted. And that's really the challenge. That's going to be difficult for us. We're not there yet. And I don't have the unknown unknowns that's difficult. Maybe Jochen has a way to explain some of that.
I have thoughts, but I feel some obligation to ask one more question from the audience. And it's a series of questions that I linked together, which is, it seems obvious that the world is changing, possibly for the worst because of climate change and human activities. How close are we to giving people advice? Ties into your mention of the very dangerous word prediction. But there's one person who says, is it safe to travel to Egypt? Or should I distinguish between an infection with vivax versus falciparum, etc.? So the question is, how close are we to helping people in near-term forecasting? Let's call it that.
So I didn't mention the falciparum. The reason that we can be relatively sure that this was probably Plasmodium falciparum is that it's the only strain of malaria that has that kind of impact on a human population at an epidemic form. The other thing as well is that we're looking at the genomes to distinguish whether people had resistance to Vivax, et cetera, et cetera. So all of that is part of it. Sorry, but the question more specifically, I don't know, I sort of feel further away from that than I did 2 or 5 years ago. I think that because you realize the level of complexity, and so this is, I'm not going to answer the question, I'm going to make another call. We really need more people involved. We sort of need people to help us take that model, because these data sets are in principle gatherable today as well. So why is it that we're not what would be the steps? I mean, we in our team is fairly large, but even we have a limited capacity to think about these things and to transition them to modern context. I think the main challenge will be the speed with which things change now, and epidemics could happen so much more quickly. What I think we can do is, from this deeper understanding of the past, we do have an opportunity to say these are the main parameters. But when I spoke to Steve Kearns at Gates, I said to him, basically, you could go from your office at 21 degrees, into a car at 21 degrees, to an airport at 21 degrees, into a plane at 21 degrees, into another country, 12 hours of flight away, all at 21 degrees. And mosquitoes function at about 26, something like that. That's at optimum. Eric Mordecai, who's a Stanford faculty member, has done brilliant work on this. Mosquitoes are inherently adaptable. If they adapt to slight fluctuations in temperature, environment, or through climate change, we will face this problem again. So it is incumbent, the moment things become a bit calm, we sort of say, okay, everything is fine. But honestly, history is telling us these things are going to recur and recur and recur. And a better understanding, it's not about eliminating. I really hate the idea of eradication, elimination. I think this is more about a better understanding to promote better actions, and to do things in a way that don't require this deployment, because we also saw all of the social, economic, but very social upheavals that took place during the last pandemic. How can we avoid some of that? How can we sort of think and predict what will happen, and what those small mechanisms in a society that could be taken to sort of prevent the scale of change that we saw recently?
All right, I have one last thing, because there's so many questions here about multimodal and will it give you the final answer? And the honest answer on some level is it depends. But the approaches I think that we're talking about here are not about writing a better AI, but a more flexible AI. Multimodal is not more powerful. It's just more adaptable. So it's a personalized AI. And so I think, for instance, that's where the power lies. That's what we're pursuing. It's easy for me to talk about it. In medicine, it's much easier to understand what personalized means. But I think in this context, on a global level, we will figure it out. That's one of my thoughts. And so I think the other thing is that at the risk of, I'm a big fan of Big Bang Theory. Right. And my question here is, do we need more theoretical physicists as opposed to engineers to help us build the kind of probabilistic, likelihood-based approaches that we can integrate with the engineering? And I guess you will give me a perspective on what that means to you, especially in. I'd love one last question is, you have all these global projects, Italy and Mauritius, etc. Where does it take you?
Where does it take me?
Yeah, well, how do you integrate it? And when do you know that what you learn in Mauritius becomes in some way relevant?
I think the comparative, the comparative context is, are we seeing similarities in these different parts of the world based on these different ecological conditions? I think some of this really has to be exploratory, fundamental science first. Some of the kind of results and outcomes are already exciting enough to stimulate us to keep going. But ultimately, the idea is to be applied in places like Zimbabwe, where we really need that support. So that would be my answer.
Well, any more questions from the room? I know Krish asked me to finish on time. So I'll revert back to my role as moderator. But in that case, thank you, Krish. Thank you to everybody.
Thank you.